Welcome to Toward a Net Zero Future. You may be closer than you think. Moderated by Andy Brown.
Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Andy Brown and I'll be your moderator for this session towards a net zero future. You may be closer than you think. My day job, when I'm not standing slightly uncomfortably on a stage that is quite intimidatingly big, is the editor of International Construction magazine. The magazine covers all types of construction equipment from all over the world, and we have a real focus on sustainability and new technology. So firstly, I'd like to thank you all for attending. 8:30 in the morning is on the early side, especially for Vegas. But it's great to see so many of you here. And our aim this morning is to have a real discussion with this great panel on what is such a massive, massive issue. So during this panel, we would really love your feedback. We've got a number of questions for you throughout the session. So before we start, if you could all scan that QR code on your phones, then that would be brilliant. And then we'll be able to get your participation throughout this session. Okay, so if everybody's done that, we'll go on to the first question. So not quite to do with sustainability to start off with, but I thought, when in Rome, so with us being in Las Vegas, my question is, if you are playing blackjack and you have a hand of 16 and the dealer has a hand of 10, do you hit? So do you take another card? Do you stick with what you've got? Or if you're feeling particularly brave, do you double down? So do you double your bet and take one more card? So I can see that people are answering. Thank you very much.
Race, I like it.
I was going to say, a little bunch of gamblers here.
Yeah, I like it.
Okay, so it seems that most of the people in the room do know what they're doing when it comes to cards. So most people have said hit. And statistically, if you hit on 16 when the dealer's got 10, you have a 30% chance of winning, which is more than the other ones. For the people that said double down, that is just really, really quite an aggressive play. So if anyone does play tonight in Vegas and wins, then feel free to come and see me and maybe share some of the winnings. Right, so we've got an absolutely fantastic panel with us today, who I shall now introduce. So to start off with, we have Dietmar Grimm, who is the Vice President of Sustainability Solutions at Trimble. So Dietmar has spent the last 20 years leading companies, non-profits and government efforts to drive global change, to drive global systems change for a more sustainable future. He is responsible for Trimble's approach to strategic management and key Trimble initiatives, including commercializing sustainability and carbon through the efficiency and productivity gains delivered by Trimble products. Interesting fact about Dietmar, he started brewing his own beer at home when he was 17 years old in Colorado. He says this was because his German dad was not happy with the quality of the local beer, but I think perhaps it was just a way for a 17-year-old Dietmar to get his hands on some beer. So sitting next to Dietmar, we have Sami Lashkaman, who is partner ESG at PwC. So Sami has decades of experience helping companies shape their ESG and sustainability strategy, leveraging technology and data. So he's a partner with PwC's ESG consulting practice based in Houston, focused on the intersection of digital and ESG. He's worked with organizations in over 100 countries and is also co-chair of the Open Footprint Forum, which is an industry group developing a global data standard for greenhouse gases and sustainability data. So Sami told me that the last time he went trick-or-treating for Halloween, he was in drag and he ended up at the house of a former president. So maybe if you see Sami later, you can ask him exactly what he was doing and who the president was. Next to Sami, we have Paul Hedow, who is the Group Director, Knowledge and Innovation at Ramboll. So Paul has more than 30 years of management experience. He's an expert on innovation, change management, knowledge management, and strategy and business development. He's currently responsible for technology and digital transformation at Ramboll, the global architecture, engineering, and consultancy company headquartered in Denmark. Paul says he does not watch TV shows, but is a big fan of comics, especially the Peanuts strip. And last but no means least, we have Dr. Ray Gallant, Vice President, Product Management and Productivity for Volvo North America. So Ray is responsible for the company's vision for future product development and technology, sales and operator training programs, customer center operations, and the Volvo CE demonstration program. So prepare to feel that your education perhaps isn't as it might be, as Ray holds a degree of science, chemistry, a Bachelor of Science in Forest Engineering, a Master of Science in Management degree, and a Doctor of Business Administration degree. If you see him at the bar, he's quite partial to a Moscow Mule. So that is the panel, an absolutely excellent panel. So just very quickly, what are our goals and objectives? What do we want to achieve from this session? Sustainability is obviously a mega trend, not just in construction, but around the whole world. We can see what's going on at the moment with COP27 taking place in Egypt, and some of the warnings about what might happen if we don't all increase our sustainability and reduce emissions. So hopefully we'll be able to set the scene for construction's carbon emissions, provide some clarity on exactly what science-based targets are, and maybe look at some of the other jargon and technical terms. We'll look at some of the key drivers for reducing the industry's greenhouse gas emissions, such as government regulations and financial pressure, and obviously look at some of the ways that technology is helping to increase sustainability. So just a quick point that I'd like to make is I don't think that sustainability has to be this big and scary thing. Sustainability comes in many forms, and one of these is being more productive and more efficient, something that construction has been striving for forever. So if you're using less fuel on projects or less concrete or less materials, you're being more sustainable. So a lot of companies are striving for it without perhaps even putting it in that box. So as we can see from the slide behind me, so construction's impact on global carbon emissions. So there's some pretty stark figures on the stage. Dietmar, would you be able to just walk us through some of those stats?
Sure, yeah. We saw these numbers for those of you that were at Rob's presentation yesterday morning. And when I look at these numbers, there's sort of two takeaways that I think are really important. As Andy said, there's one lens on these numbers, which is it feels stark. 25%, 37%, it feels big, right? It's like, wow, that's a large number. And in some parts of the world, and I feel from some people I talk to, it's almost looked on as negatively, like, wow, construction, you're harming the world, right? But I think there's another lens to it that I like to take, which is, well, of course it's that large, because construction is one of the foundational sectors of the entire economy. So of course it's going to be a big number because it's driving the future of the planet together, right? And so for me on that lens, it is, as opposed to saying it's this negative, wow, big emitter, instead it's, wow, there's this huge opportunity and maybe a sense of responsibility. And as we'll talk a little bit more today, that many of you in this room, I'm always shocked and inspired by conversations I have with all of you and in sessions yesterday that people are actually doing a lot of sustainability, may not even know it. So that's the first takeaway is, wow, this is actually a positive in many ways that we can take leadership going forward. And the second one is, as you can see from the other numbers of where it's laid out, is like, okay, there's great opportunities in every part of what we do in construction, from design to build to operate. Every part of that is important, and there's opportunities in every part of construction to make a difference.
Great, thank you, Dietmar. Sammy, would you like to add to that? Where do you see the opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, I think a good way I think you described it as opportunities, right? I mean, I think people are looking at these numbers. So first of all, the world has access to these numbers, right? You'll see it on LinkedIn, you'll see it on Facebook, you'll see it on, maybe not on Twitter, but anyways, long story short, you've got visibility to these numbers, but equally you're starting to see companies react to these numbers, right? You're starting to see, I was talking to a steel company yesterday, they're already thinking about carbon-free steel. Was with a university a couple of weeks ago, and one of the top 3 deciding factors that they had in the building of a new, in the construction of a new building that they were putting on campus was the carbon offsets that it was going to generate, right? So they were already thinking about, is it this kind of timber, is it carbon-free cement, et cetera? They were already thinking that way, right? And so if you're a supplier, you're a designer, you're a builder, you're an operator, whatever you, part of the industry, the part of the value chain, it is a huge opportunity because there's massive opportunity. The better you can improve on these numbers, the better you are than the next person who can't improve on these numbers.
Great, thank you. And we won't, for each question, we're not going to go down like this for all of them, but Paul, I just wanted to, you mentioned to me the other day that kind of Ramble had gone all in on sustainability. Could you maybe kind of explain to us kind of what that means?
Well, that means actually that we have put sustainability at the center of our strategy, which means that it is the only, you could say, driver for growth. And that has also taken, of course, some serious considerations and implications on our current business. So we actually now do validate clients based on their willingness to follow our ambitions. And we also look into our entire project portfolio and kind of slim that so that we actually deliver on the promises that we have given also to our staff. And we actually see that we have staff that are very, very engaged in this and also expect us to deliver on this, basically telling us that if you do not, then we will find other places to work where they will make that impact that you do not do. Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. And Ray, in terms of kind of Volvo, are you seeing it as something that has kind of changed from maybe in the past was a nice to do to now being an essential, and kind of what are your customers telling you about this?
I think it has changed in general within society, within governmental viewpoints. The drive is certainly there to be more sustainable, environmentally friendly. At Volvo, our core value has been environmental care for decades, so this is not new to us, it's in our DNA. So this is a welcome change for us, a welcome direction. Volvo, of course, is a Scandinavian company, so similar to Paul, we live it, we see it, we breathe it every day, so it's a good step forward.
Great, thank you everybody. So we have another question now. I don't think this one's about blackjack. No, so if you could again get out your phones and scan. So the question is sustainability a big cost or do you think it's a competitive advantage? So 1 means big cost and 10 means competitive advantage. Perfect, thank you all for voting. So at the moment, yeah, as we can see, about half of the people in here say it's a significant advantage.
And feel free to be honest, we're not going to fact check you afterwards. So.
Okay, that's perfect. So that, I guess, kind of, that sort of reiterates kind of what you were all saying. Are you surprised at that number, or is that what you would have expected?
I would say I'm a little surprised by the number. Of course, I'm excited by it, but I've been inspired so much by the entire dimension so far in settings where I didn't expect people to be really thinking about sustainability, and they were, and seeing that this really is business aligned for them. And I think, I feel I've been working on sustainability related issues for about 20 years, and there's been some sort of inflection point that's happened in the last couple of years that I feel this isn't as surprising as I might have been if it was from before.
Yeah, I mean, for me, same with you. I was kind of surprised. I'd have thought it'd been more in the 2 to 3 kind of range that have been picked up. But I guess equally, I mean, as I sit back, I mean, you're all in this room to listen about net zero at 8:30 in the morning in Vegas, so shouldn't be too surprised by the demographic. But equally, is it representative of the 5,000 people? I'd be curious to see around that. But
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I would argue that from where I'm coming from the consulting engineering place, I think sustainability is a license to play. It's not a cost. It's something you need to do. It's something that's expected. And when we afterwards get to discussions about financial drivers, it's actually also, if you see where funding is channeled today, it's towards these, right? From governmental, from private, whatever, right? So we need to take this on.
Yeah. Paul, do you see anybody in your construction engineering that are sort of in that one bucket, right? The cost with no real incentives. I mean, are you running into folks that are like, no, this makes no sense?
No. You ask me?
Either one.
Yeah, I think that I don't see, within the industry where I'm operating, right, I don't see anybody that consider sustainability and the investment that you need to do. I mean, it's an investment rather than a cost, if you get my point, right?
Yeah.
As I said, getting back to what I said, it's a license to play. You need to be in that space.
And I think there has been a shift going on. This same question probably 4 or 5 years ago would have probably had a different answer. But I think people are getting over that initial denial stage. You know, they don't want to deal with it, don't want to hear about it. You know, everything's going to stay the same it is. The fear of change. Now we're getting into, a lot of people are looking at the opportunities and taking advantage of that. So competitive advantage is not only that we're more environmentally friendly, it's quiet machines, it's being able to work indoors, it's all kinds of other technologies that are coming along that customers are seeing opportunities with that they could never do with a machine, in our case, with a machine in the past. So we have applications coming out that we would have never thought to design for that now are possible with electric machines. So I think that's being reflected as well.
Oh, sorry. I think that's a great point. You know, for those of you who saw Aviad's presentation yesterday, I really think that one of the inflection points, we'll talk about many others, but I hadn't thought about until you brought it up, is this technology advancement. Now it's come to a fruition that the costs are actually lower, right? There was, a decade ago, it was really expensive to do certain things, and now you can do things to optimize. You know, the EV, you know, market, everything has come, the costs have come down so significantly now that it really is a no-brainer in many ways.
Okay, perfect. So if we move on to the next slide. So obviously government regulations and incentives can really drive the uptake of whatever it is that they are focused on, sustainability being no different. So Sammy, if I can ask you first, kind of, are there regulations in place that kind of reward and encourage sustainable building, and is Biden's infrastructure bill one of them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as much as we often think about government regulations being sort of command control, you know, affecting us, I think it's equally as important, you know, if you start to think about the net zero journey, you start to think about decarbonization, it's really a question of how do you pay for that, right? I mean, you start to think about, I can either go to net zero by charging my customers more, because it's going to cost money. Bottom line, it will cost money in some form or fashion. That's not to say you won't recoup the money. It is an investment, to your point. But equally, I think it's good to understand the amount of money that's available. This is just from the government perspective, right? Whether it's the Infrastructure Act or the IRA. I mean, the trillions of dollars and the $400 billion in the IRA, and someone actually told me the other day, like, there isn't actually a cap on that. Like, if you actually go read the regulation, I don't think there actually is a cap to that, right? So you think about the sheer amount of money that's available, and you start to think about the opportunity to become clean energy, low carbon, start to think about the industries. I was in Louisiana a couple weeks ago, and it was interesting to talk to businesses there where you've got, you know, fairly impoverished parishes, right? Like just they don't have a lot of money. What a great opportunity to set up new businesses, new industries, new institutes, et cetera, based on that low carbon, based on this kinds of investment to boost the local economies. If that's what you want to do from a company perspective in terms of social justice, if that's what you do from a government perspective. So I think there's a huge opportunity to incentivize that, subsidize that in some form or fashion, you know? So it's just something to think about. Not that there aren't other roles of government regulations to make sure that there's, you know, the right level of disclosure and so on and so forth, but, you know, can talk through that as well. So.
Okay. Thank you. So.
There we go.
Yeah, exactly.
I was like, I thought we had something.
Almost as if we planned this, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's crazy.
Exactly. And I mean, just to kind of maybe lay the scene a little bit on this, right? Like, and keep in mind, when you, like, the SEC proposed rule. Once again, I use this as an example. Whether you feel right about it or wrong, the one thing it's there to do is not to actually force you to decarbonize. It's not to force you to go to net zero. It's force you to disclose your numbers that you're already disclosing with a level of transparency and trust. No different than you do financial numbers, right? I mean, I live in Houston. I lived through the Enron days, and you know, where numbers were a little bit fuzzy, right? So, you know, that's all the SEC proposed rule is trying to do, is provide a level of transparency. And by the way, it's not just the SEC. You've got, EU taxonomy, you've got CSRD. So global companies right now are already spending time and energy to report those numbers. And so it's just about making sure that those disclosures are done with a level of transparency, are done with a level of trust, and that the greenwashing is reduced. Because you still see live examples of that. There's, banks that just, probably just in the last month or two that have been accused of greenwashing and so on and so forth. So just to provide a level of transparency around that, right? So, I think that's the other role that the government can play.
Okay, great, thanks. Paul, would you be able to give us a little insight into some of the European rules? And
Yeah, I think that one thing that I would highlight here is the EU, what do you call it? Sustainability taxonomy, or the EU taxonomy on sustainability, which is a regulation that are coming in place now, actually. And if I was to do a comparison, I could make, everybody, at least in Europe, will remember the data privacy regulations that were enforced on, companies, projects, institutions, and what have you. And basically, the EU taxonomy is about also a requirement that you document your, you could say, the sustainability of your solutions in projects as a company and also public institutions. So it's something that will, as an engineer, working in an engineering company, I'm looking forward to have that because it will probably mean a lot of business, right, coming our way. Because our clients will need our support to provide that, documentation on their projects and on their setup. I think another perspective is slightly different. Is that people want it. I mean, politicians need to respond to this agenda because there are voters out there that really put place their votes on politicians that are driving this agenda. So you will also see that not only from EU but also in national government where there are similar regulations in place, and you will see it even also at the city level. Yeah.
Okay.
And you're also going to see more regulations too. I mean, right now we've got TCFD up there from a climate perspective. You're now looking at TNFD, right? The nature-based solutions. You're looking at, almost every country in the world starting to think about this. And you heard this loud and clear at COP27. That's also going on this week, right? So you're starting to see, countries, respond and react accordingly. The big challenge, especially for the big multinationals, is it's going to be a patchwork of regulations, right? Like every country is going to be different. Every state is going to be different depending on what their views are, et cetera, and that will create challenges.
Yeah.
I think,
but I think also it will be work coming at your direction.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. We love being an accounting company in a world of carbon accounting.
Yeah.
One of the things I like in it too is I feel like the sustainability world, the carbon world, has actually been, it's very new in some ways, right? And so I go back to what Woz said the other day is, in life you want to have some organization, right? A little bit of organization, and sort of like how the financial sector back in the early 1900s was kind of chaotic. We didn't have good rules on like how to report on your finances and those kinds of things. And guess what? We ended up having a Great Depression as part of that being a driver for it, right? And so now we're in these early days of just trying to set the rules for, well, what does this really mean? How do we do it? And there are actually bodies around the world that are trying to make sure it's localized in certain ways, but that there's some consistency too, right? Because that's what we need, I feel, from business is I don't want things changing all the time. Just tell me what the rules are, and then we can manage by and run through, our solutions with the right rules, right? And so that's what's happening right now is a little bit of figuring out those rules and then setting the stage for how we can succeed as business going forward.
Okay. I think the other thing that's a bit different this time around as well is the technologies span a number of different industries. So with diesel regulations that came out a few years ago, the TIR regulations, it was basically just around diesel engines. The fuel supply was there, it was developed over the last 100 years. Now as we go into battery electric, hydrogen fuels, and all those more exotic options, the government regulations in helping control and standardize not only how the machines and tools will work, but how the fuel systems develop in the different countries is a big part of this. So more than ever, we need the government involvement because no single company works the whole realm. It's a multitude of companies over very different industries and technologies being regulated to go at the same speed and the same delivery targets at the end. So,
I would actually argue it's also the other way around, that industries will push the government, to see that more holistic perspective of things, right? Yeah.
And that's also encouraging that that's happening more and more this time. Like we're more, as industry, we're more involved in government think tanks, lobby groups,
Right.
and helping them do the regulations and understand the technologies coming up. So in past times, there were some times that the regulations would just appear and all of a sudden industry's caught off guard and have no way of meeting it, and that caused a lot of disruption. This time I see a very different pattern happening, so.
Yeah, I think when we looked at the comments that were for the SEC rule, even just a subset of those, right? It wasn't all. I mean, I know there's the rule got extended, but I think just in that initial comment period, something like 87% of the respondents, of people who provided comments, were actually in favor of the disclosure rules in some form or fashion. Some wanted obviously changed, and some were minor changes, and some were bigger changes. But I mean, equally, the nice thing too is that the world has a precedent for this. I mean, once again, I use my 1099 form as my best example, right? Like, no one doubts box 1A. It's not like I take those, when I get that thing in the mail in January, I go, oh, that number must be wrong. Let me go do my due diligence on that number or my interest or my dividend. But we don't have that same level of credibility and trust in the carbon numbers, right? You give me a carbon number, or I give you one for my flight here. You have no idea how I calculated that number. Did I look it up on Google? Did I actually do the math around it? Did I figure out what aircraft I was flying? Like, there's no basis for that. So once again, that transparency will help people make better decisions,
Yeah, and that disclosure is, as you say, that's transparency.
Yeah.
So once we have that transparency, we can start working on a solution. If we don't understand the problem, it's pretty hard to come up with a solution.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, perfect. So from one driver to another, so obviously the markets are also driving this and saying they're more likely to invest in either a product or a company if it's sustainable. Sam, if I could come to you first, could you give your take on the role of finance in this?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the finance industry, there is a tremendous amount of capital out there, trillions and trillions of dollars, right? And I'll start with the middle one, that assessment of risks out there, because it was interesting, once again, sort of in my conversations with clients. What was acceptable 4 or 5 years ago is no longer acceptable, right? You have a hurricane that comes in, and you think about the construction industry. You have a hurricane that comes in now. Once again, I live in Texas, right? So lots of those. What's now declared a force majeure is no longer acceptable, simply because there's other companies that have now hardened their infrastructure, their assets. They've now built for it. They've accommodated for those risks. So therefore, they're able to withstand those kinds of risks, or they've done something about them. So if you haven't done anything, if you haven't done a physical risk assessment or a transition risk assessment, you're actually behind, right? And that's a real problem for some of the especially some of the material assets that are, the Gulf Coast, for example. We talked a lot about disclosure, so I won't dive too much into that. But once again, the amount of capital that's available, infrastructure funds, private equity funds, angel investors, banks, et cetera, that are willing to loan money to do this. Because keep in mind, they've made net zero commitments as well. There's a whole bunch of them out there that have said, ooh, we're going to go to net zero. The only way they can do that is to finance and provide capital to organizations, to companies, to projects, to initiatives that will help them achieve that low carbon transition. Now, otherwise, they're not going to meet their goals, and that's going to hurt them with their own shareholders. Now, is that today, tomorrow? Maybe, but it's a long journey, and they know if they don't start doing that today, tomorrow, they're not going to be able to meet their goals in 2030 or 2050 or whatever the case may be. But that also means it's an opportunity, coming back to what you were saying, Dietmar, earlier, which is you've got the opportunity to get the access to that capital sooner, at much better rates than the next guy. Because right now, there's not a lot of projects out there that really warrant trillions of dollars out there. So if you can get out there in the front and ahead of the next person or the next company to secure that capital, that's pretty powerful stuff.
I'll add that I feel the finance sector has created a lot of confusion recently in the sustainability markets. And this is a little bit more for the sustainability nerds out there like us up here. It's been frustrating because it's been exciting about how it's been embraced. Consumers, investors really want to invest in things as part of their portfolio that they know are driving sustainability. But the confusion has been around that middle category, that there's a difference between investing and looking for companies that are managing their risk that they have in ESG, so that they have environmental risk. Are they susceptible to hurricanes? Are they susceptible to fires? Which is an important financial thing to be considering, right? But what they haven't done as good a job recently is embracing and separating from that risk, which is the opportunity. Like if you're a company that is driving sustainability, the financial markets haven't done as good a job of identifying how do we manage for that, how do we understand the information, how do we have the data so that we can see both that the company is decarbonizing and they're helping decarbonize their sector or something like that. And so there's been a lot of confusion because people have been saying, why does this not get a good risk score, or what they call sustainability score at the time they were calling it, or ESG score, when they knew it was doing something really big for to decarbonize, but maybe it had a lot of risk because they were near a hurricane zone. So we need to clarify that. I think that's where one place where finance has created a little bit of confusion right now, and it's in this sort of chaotic phase of figuring that out and solving for it.
I think, again, if I'm taking the European perspective, and that's what I know best, right? Again, here you'll see institutional investors and pension funds. They actually do not anymore support non-sustainable projects, right? That's definite. It's over. So they would always ask for you could say, a sustainable assessment of the project before they ever consider funding it. And I think that's interesting also, just probably a bit off a tangent, but the pension fund that are managing the pensions of Rumble employees, they offer an opportunity to put your investments in a green portfolio. So the individual is also given a mandate. Mm-hmm. And you might like this, Dietmar, because Trimble is actually part of the green portfolio of that pension fund. Yeah. So, yeah. But I think another thing is getting back to, I know that it's not necessarily on the financial role, but again, looking at where funding is channeled, right? And the infrastructure bill in the US is a clear demonstration on that there are certain commitments. It's not just up for grabs, right? You need to document also the viability of your projects in terms of sustainability, and that goes across the board as well, yeah. And also at a city level, again, I'll see we have some of the major cities across the world that have established what they call Green City Council, I think it is, mm-hmm. right? Where they also share experiences and across the globe, and so that they can repurpose, solutions or reuse solutions from one city to the other. And again, here, driven by. Of course, not necessarily financial, but looking for opportunities to increase the resilience of the cities based on directing funding to these kinds of projects. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So I think we've got another question coming up for everybody. Are you familiar with the Science Based Targets Initiative? No, it was neck and neck. It's now 55%.
Ooh, there we go.
Oh, wow.
Okay, that I'm not surprised by the answer.
Yeah.
Okay, well that's that leads us quite nicely then into the next slide. If we're saying that over 70% of the people here are saying no, then we should talk about it, shouldn't we? Yeah. So, Dietmar, could I ask you to lead on this?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about it, and maybe we can go to the next slide too. What we've talked about just before was how basically government and regulation, even society, is driving us towards trying to solve climate change, basically, and understand carbon emissions and set these rules, get organized, right? And one of the big things that's happened in the last couple of years is the world has started to organize, and the world, being us as a corporate sector, has started to organize saying, hey, we can't just rely on government. We need to lead also. We need to say that we can drive carbon emissions down, and we need a set of rules by which to do it. And so the Science-Based Targets Initiative sort of is the representation of that, of the private sector saying we want to voluntarily say that we want to drive towards the goals that we need to basically achieve the Paris objectives of 1.5 degrees Celsius pathways. And so there's 4 key components to it that I like to describe, that are just what it is. One is, hey, you have to actually set your target, right? The idea is you start and you look at what your carbon emissions today, you want to measure them, and then understand the path that you can get to reduce your carbon emissions over time. While you're doing that, you want to offset some of your remainder emissions, and then have a plan for, all businesses or many businesses are going to have some remainder emissions at the end that you're going to have long-term sort of abilities to address it. So that's the key thing about what science-based targets are is, hey, I'm a company, I want to voluntarily join the Science-Based Targets Initiative because we want to drive towards these objectives. And it's really the corporate sector taking on leadership from that. And that's the one thing that for me, if we go to the next slide really quickly, has really been impressive. We were talking about how there's been this inflection point in the last couple of years, is corporate leadership has really stepped up. I think all of us on this stage have joined the Science-Based Targets Initiative. A shout out to my colleague Emily Sanwa-Sangren, who's our director of ESG, who really drove Trimble in this direction too, so we just were approved this year. And so it really is amazing to see that it went from just a few companies back in 2015 to literally when we were applying, when Emily was driving our team and working with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, they were overwhelmed. It took them forever actually to help to get us approved, just because they were overwhelmed with the thousands of companies that have joined. And I've been talking to many of you in the audience, and it turns out either your companies have joined Science-Based Targets Initiative, or your companies are starting to measure your carbon, address them, have a plan. So it's really about corporate leadership now saying, it's like our sort of space program moonshot movement, right? Government played a really important role and still plays an important role, but private sector has had a key role in that and is now taking it to the next level, and I think that's what's happening now.
Yeah. The other big thing on the science-based targets is your customers, in many cases, may have science-based targets, and we're actually starting to see this more and more, where we've had larger organizations. If you start to think about sort of the supply chain, and you get into some fairly large organizations, whoever they might be in whatever sector they might be, you're starting to see many of those larger companies setting science-based targets. And once again, the only way they're going to achieve them is if their suppliers upstream of them set their science-based targets. So I just to give you a very candid example, I had a client call me, and it was like September 30th or September 29th. And they're like, our largest customer just said, we need to have science-based targets. And they didn't directly say that would impact their material level of business going forward, but there was definitely a strong inclination, a strong leaning that way. If this is how you want to do work for this customer going forward, you yourself need to have science-based targets. And the very first question is, what's a science-based target? That's literally the first question I got, so we educated them on it. But they didn't, by the way, that was September 29th. They had to decide by October 1st. So it wasn't like they had like months to go decide. In 2 days, they literally had to go call one of their biggest customers and say yes or no. And it was as explicit as that, and that would then materially affect their business with that customer going forward. So just something to also consider in that process.
Okay, thank you. I mean, obviously, there's so many different players in construction that are committing to sustainability, isn't it? I was at the Bauma show in Germany last week, and spoke to the CEO of Doka, who are a major force work and formwork player, and he was telling me that they've basically measured the carbon footprint for all of their products. So I think it took them 2 years, 6,000 products. So that's the life cycle of it. So that's from sourcing the raw materials, the manufacturing, and the using it. And he was saying, kind of echoing what you were saying, that was something that would help their customers, because their customers have their own targets. So therefore, if Doga can provide them this information, then that would benefit them as well.
One of the things I'd say that's important now, I've been impressed in the last couple of years about this explosion. But this is really about, again, kind of setting the rules, getting a common language about how we talk about carbon. And what's fascinating to me now is it's already at another inflection point where it's like, okay, set the targets. I don't want to just have targets. I want to see traction against those targets. And so now there's a real push by people, and again, it's customers and others that are saying, I want to see what are the actual activities now you're doing to deliver this. So you have to have the targets, but actually be making real progress too.
I think one of the very important things about the science-based targets is they were set out in the far future. Yeah. So all our companies, we have a tendency, especially in North America, to look at the quarterly results, the monthly results, very short-term focus. This forced everybody to sit back and say, okay, what's the technology roadmap for the next 25 years? And how do I fit into that? Where's my position as a company in that technology development? And force us to make those decisions. And I think that's a good step for society, and it will shake out to be more relevant examples and solutions coming forward.
And in terms of these targets, obviously absolutely key to them is to have accurate data and data that can be verified. So kind of how much further along with that are we than we were in the past?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the short answer is we're further along, but that's the key question. And that's one of the big challenges that I think we've seen in the sector, and where people have had confusion around carbon, and if we ever end up talking about offsets, I think you mentioned offsets or insets. It's like it's really the Wild West. I'll just say it's really the Wild West. And what we've found is getting that information and having it be transparent and having the technology behind it is really critical, and having it be accessible to folks. And that's just in the very, very early stages. I mean, literally some of the ways in which we report on carbon, it's kind of like what it looked like to me for a while was a registry that something I could have programmed in HTML in like 1990, right? It was kind of how it was managed, and it's just like, wow, it's improved since then, but it's like, it's very, very early days. And so I think there's a lot of room to grow there, and that's a lot of, at least for us with Trimble, where we see we can play an important role with our customers of thinking about, well, how do we actually work together to do a better job of measuring these improvements and our own direct carbon emissions?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity to learn. I mean, some of these industries have been doing it for years. I mean, I remember working in the oil and gas industry. They were doing carbon emission calculations at a minute-by-minute level literally a decade ago, I mean, and they did that for all of their operations globally, right, from, random islands in Southeast Asia to all the way up to like Alaska, so to speak. So, and that was literally, that was 12 years ago, right? So the technologies existed. It didn't matter as much now, because it didn't matter as much back then. 12 years ago, no one cared except for some regulators and maybe some investors and so on and so forth. Now it's a much more material difference, and now it's much more global. Previously it was just oil and gas, mining, utilities, et cetera. Now it's everybody, right? So now it makes a much more material difference. I think it's also equally okay for people to acknowledge where they're estimating. Like, it doesn't have to be perfect. We don't have perfect numbers even in the accounting world right now. We make estimates, we make assumptions. The key thing is to document those estimates and those assumptions so that people understand, how did you get to the number? How did you get to that value, so that people understand what it is? That's not to say that you can't improve, but once again, the technology is still improving, right? I mean, whether you're using satellite imagery versus, LDAR versus, emission factors versus some value you looked up in a book, those are all different values. And once again, the regulation hasn't quite aligned either, right? Like, some of those you literally can't report to the government because they don't allow that, So now you got two sets of books, and as an accountant, we really love those, right? So, I don't know.
I think a point here is also that, to set targets, you need a baseline. So actually, this forces us to establish the baseline, which we probably haven't, at least, done in a detailed way before. So we actually now start to get numbers on our current operation and how that impact, right? And then we can start setting targets and ambitions from there. Right?
Okay, great. So we kind of talked about in quite a kind of a top level way, I guess, in some ways, but kind of it'd be interesting to talk about, some of the things that companies are already doing. And if I could go to you first, Ray, and maybe you could share with us some of the ways that Volvo is implementing sustainability, and maybe touch on some of the products that you've got now and what you might have in the future?
Yeah, and I think this is not new. We've been doing this for the past 20, 30 years, especially since the tier regulations came in 20 years ago. That did a lot to bring the emissions in diesel fuel down, and we're really now taking the next step. So in Volvo's case and in a lot of other companies, we're starting to produce battery electric machines, which is not really that new a technology. Electrical drives have been around for years, but finally starting to package them and advance the battery technology to make them more efficient, more productive, quiet, and affordable, which is a very important piece of it. Along with this, there's also a lot of attention being paid to how do you refuel it, how do you recharge it, and that's probably the bigger challenge. You know, I probably shouldn't say this, but from a machine manufacturing company, electrifying a machine and putting a battery in it is the easy part. So we can do that, we can make it perform even better than a diesel machine, but it's how do you get it on the job site, how do you refuel it, recharge it properly and quickly, and how do the sites have to change to take advantage of the unique features of that electric drive. So it's not just a matter of replacing a once-a-day fuel truck on your site with a charging station. It's a matter of, okay, how do you schedule the charging of the machines so that your operations don't get interrupted and that you have the grid power when you need it. We had the recent example in California where, you know, 1 week they were saying everybody should buy electric cars by 2035, and that same week they had brownouts and shutdowns and don't plug in your electric car. So we have to avoid circumstances like that and overtaxing the grid at the situation or at the level that it's at today.
Okay. And Paul, maybe could you touch on some of the key ways that you guys are driving sustainability?
To me, there is, again, getting back to the baseline, right? Rumble design more than 10 million square meter buildings every year. That's 100 million square feet, approximately, right? And we have put, and of course, historically, we know our designs and we can calculate the carbon footprint of those designs, right? We have put an ambition that in 2 years, will reduce the carbon footprint per design square meter by 25%. Again, I'm getting back to that we need to know the baseline before we can set targets, right? And that's Dietmar, where we need your help, right? Because we, extensively use your products in doing the designs. And these two examples are, and you'll see that it's not only buildings or structures. It's structures, it's MEP, it's infrastructure or civil, it's architecture. So we need your you could say your products, your applications, your software to seamlessly in interoperability between those software. And why is this important to us now and to this discussion actually? Well, that is because if data is isolated, then individuals and teams will also be isolated, which means that collaboration will be impacted, which means that we'll not achieve the optimal solutions that we set out to do. So we'll actually not be able to deliver the sustainable solutions that we are looking for. So I think that's important to us. And I know yesterday in the keynote you talked about pace and speed and what have you. This is something where I would really encourage you to put the pedal down. The other thing is that we also look into our own operations, right? And one of the things that we are looking for is also reducing our footprint, for example, by travel. So next year I'll probably not come here. No, I don't. No, but I mean there will be some restrictions on how we expect to what behavior we expect from our operations. And then finally, also to the point that was made before about that we actually also we need our partners to help us deliver on our commitments on science-based targets, which means already today we're asking our partners to sign up when we renew our agreements for the shared commitments that we have. Yeah.
Well, I love what you're saying, if I may jump in on that one, which is you've been one of the biggest advocates for just generally like, hey, we need to have like a TC1, a one construction cloud. These things need to work together because in some version of the world, the mind might think design, build, operate are different things. They could work in their silos, and actually it isn't. I was actually at a session that I didn't even know was going to be something that could be around sustainability yesterday. That was from, I think his name was Jared Redelman from Bowen Engineering, and he was showing how they were using the HoloLens to do walkthroughs after they were in the middle of building buildings. And with that HoloLens, they were able to compare to the design and see, oh wait, something wasn't actually implemented the way we thought it was implemented. And so they avoided a bunch of rework that was like ductwork that they would have had to otherwise rip out and replace, as one example. And to your point on measurement, if you go back one slide, we have at Trimble also, I have a bunch of colleagues and I that are in the room, Hugh McAvoy, Mike Granruth, Kat Rogers, Hari Natarajan, and a few others, that we sat down last year and said, okay, wait a second, we know as Trimble, similar to Volvo, we've been driving productivity and efficiency since the beginning. It is part of our DNA, right? And we understand that that's sustainability, but in this world of carbon, to your point earlier, you have to actually have the data. You actually have to quantify it in some way and have some background information to justify what you're doing. So our teams went out. You'll hear more if you want to go. Mike Granruth has a session later today on this auto steering compactor where we showed improvements that we could measure in terms of improved efficiency of driving just more accurately, basically. Hugh McAvoy had a presentation yesterday that was similar. It was like, hey, rather than using a HoloLens, it's like, let's scan a floor that's been poured so we can understand the things that might have happened that weren't actually according to plan, so you can avoid rework later, right? And we're seeing 20 to 30% improvements in these kinds of examples, right? These are cost improvements. In the case that Hugh showed was actually 1,000% ROI on the investment in the scanner to do this, right? From the savings you had in cost, less cement, all this kind of stuff. It's amazing the opportunity that's out there that we just need to scale. But we need the things to work better together, so it's all, we're partners together solving this as a whole ecosystem, not just one-off solutions.
Mm-hmm. If I may, I would actually like to add another dimension to this discussion, because we're very much talking about sustainability in designs and construction, right? But I think we need to, you could say, extend or expand the discussion to also the operational phase, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because that is basically probably also where the most impact can be achieved, right? So we need to be careful not to try to limit, the scope to the design and construct phase, but also looking, and we know that there are, we have also used your tools, Dietmar, in combination with, you could say homegrown tools to look into how can we optimize alignment of roads, where you know that the terrain will be the most kind of impactful factor on the fuel consumption, right? So do you go tunneling, or do you do a terrain solution? And we can actually document that even though it might be from an investment perspective a more affordable solution in the long term, from a sustainability perspective, tunneling might come out as an optimal solution, right?
Okay, great. Sorry, we have to, we're running slightly short on time, which is great because it means you guys have spoken so much and people haven't had to hear from me so much. So on the screen there, we've obviously got the sort of sustainability goals of you guys. I just kind of wonder for like the audience, rather than kind of necessarily talking about kind of what you've done, if people in the audience or companies in the audience were thinking about setting their own goals, what would your advice be for them?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's what you'll see is just common factors between all of us, right? Which is the first step, as you saw with the science-based targets, is have a plan, understand that you have a goal that you're trying to achieve over some period of time. So that's where it's like what I can do with my own direct emissions, that's your scope 1 and basically scope 2. And then it's like we heard earlier, like what can you do with your partners? That's scope 3 emissions. So you want to drive through your partner supply chains to drive emissions down. And there's a variety of other things that you can think about in terms of how you look at your energy consumption, moving more towards renewables and things like that. But those are the key components for me is start with what you know, which is your scope 1, and then work with your partners to deliver the rest.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe to build on what you described, it, like especially when you look at science-based targets and some of these goals, I mean, there is a longer time horizon to it. No one's expecting it to be zero tomorrow or day after or whatever the case might be, So I think it's setting that long-term vision, being realistic about it, right? You may not know what % reduction is achievable today. If you haven't done your baseline, you don't even know what your number is to even reduce from, let alone how much to reduce it. So I think being realistic. The other thing I'll add is sometimes you'll be surprised that even the smallest things make a difference. I had a customer the other day who described literally millions and millions of dollars of services that they were able to get from a competitor simply because of the policies that they had around diversity, around same-sex, around LGBTQ. Once again, I'm not advocating one way or the other around it, but there was a customer of theirs that literally made a material difference in an order from their nearest competitor simply because of an ESG issue, So you're starting to see companies starting to react, and once again, just being able to articulate what you're doing is important.
And the one thing I'd say that's missing here too, this goes to the confusion I think in the sector still a little bit. This is all about, what you as your own company can do yourself. I'm a big advocate also of knowing that many of you do things that you're helping others actually achieve their sustainability goals too. And we don't even have a good system for that yet, right? And so there may be a big part of what you want to do is figure out how to communicate, wow, yeah, we're doing everything we can to reduce our own emissions, but as an engineering design firm or whatever, we're actually helping our customers reduce their emissions down the road too. And so it's a whole nother category to think about as we move forward.
And plus, it's all greenhouse gas, so keep in mind there's water, waste,
yes, exactly.
social justice, et cetera, safety, right?
And I think the other thing, if you think about this, like the emission reduction we're talking about is over the entire life cycle of the product. So right from raw material extraction to disposal. And in our case, that could be 20, 30, 40 years for a piece of heavy equipment. But one of the things that we found that's very successful is if focus on the small wins, first of all, as you said, but also the cross benefits. So in our case, if you look at carbon dioxide, 90+% of the carbon dioxide pollution comes straight out of the tailpipe. It's from burning diesel. So if we're talking to a customer about reducing your CO2 footprint, basically what we're talking about is burning less fuel, being more efficient in your operations. So it's very hard to walk into a large customer and say, I want you to invest $1 million to get your carbon footprint down. It's a very easy conversation to walk in and say, I want you to invest $1 million to get fuel consumption down by 20% and productivity up by 15%.
Sure.
That's a whole different conversation. So we have to keep in mind that these benefits are all correlated. If we do our operations better, if we're more efficient in energy management, as was said, that's what's going to drive this forward and get us our carbon reduction goals that we're looking for.
Okay, great, thank you. So we've got another, I think we've got two more quick questions for you guys, if you could be so kind just to get out your phone and scan. So we're asking you, where is your company on sustainability?
And as people are responding, Ray, just to build on that, I mean, chances are those conversations are already happening. People are already doing stuff on sustainability. They just never realize they're doing it, and it's called sustainability.
Yeah, everybody's trying to get fuel consumption down.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Energy efficiency, optimization.
It's closed, is it? Okay.
Oh.
Perfect. Well, okay.
Okay.
Okay, well then we'll probably move on, I would say, and we'll probably move on from the next question as well. And this is perfect because we haven't got very long left. So I was worried that they were going to play music and get us off. So we have our final slide here, which is about sustainability storytelling. So if we could maybe just get a quick answer maybe from all of you on this. Kind of do we think that the construction industry, are we doing enough to tell our story? Like we said, obviously construction is a big emitter, but obviously an absolutely essential and huge industry. Are we doing enough to kind of get our story out there? And if not, what could we be doing?
Yeah, my short answer is no. We are not. And a part of it is because I've been humbled and super energized by all the conversations I've had with all of you, because it turns out so many of you are doing sustainability and often don't even know that it's happening. and because you're so focused on productivity, efficiency, driving margins, and it turns out you are driving sustainability. I was talking to some people this morning, and they said, yeah, I work in excavation, and I don't want to move that dirt pile more than once. And so I've done a lot to optimize around that. And I was like, that is sustainability. It's really impressive. And so we just need to embrace those stories, measure them, because we want to actually contribute in the carbon game, and celebrate those things. I think there's a lot more we can do together, especially as we build it as a partnership individually and also together to drive this and lead, as opposed to responding to what's happening in the carbon world.
Yeah, I think definitely sharing those stories more obviously, I think would be a huge step. I don't think people share enough of the good work that they already do out to the general public, would be my quick answer.
Okay, thank you.
And celebrate the wins. We tend to be a very conservative industry that, keeps to our own, but we've got to get out there and celebrate the wins. There is a lot of good work going on and has gone on for the past 20 or 30 years, so we shouldn't be ashamed of that. We should celebrate it.
I can only echo that. I think, I said that before, I think that our industry is the answer to the challenges of the world, right? And actually also have delivered the answers historically, right? So there's nothing to be ashamed of. So I think celebrate the successes. That's the answer to it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. So what's next is I'm probably going to go for a lie down. So it's just, obviously sustainability is, an absolutely mega topic. It's not going to go anywhere. The building industry, the construction industry is not going to go anywhere either. The world's population is expected to reach 8.5 billion people in 2030, 10 billion in 2050. So the amount of building stock we need is going to massively increase. So we are an absolutely essential industry. We're going to be around for a long time, and it's really important that we do all we can to kind of drive up our sustainability. And as we've already said, just to be more efficient and more productive can be a key way of doing that. So sorry we've overran slightly by a minute or two, but thank you very much for your time, everybody.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks, everybody.